What's up, everybody? Max Mick here, and today I want to bring you another Kaldheim draft guide, and this time I'm going to be focusing on a specific concept that I like to call drafting with your deck in mind. But before we can get fully into that, unfortunately, my view time and engagement increases by a lot when I give credibility and brag about my accomplishments. So I have 5 GP top 8s, 3 of which are limited, and 1 of which I won. I have an 82% win rate in the format so far, over 100 plus matches. And I won 2K in the Sealed Arena Open last weekend, so that's why you should listen to me. Now that that's over with, we can finally get into the actual useful part of my content, and I want to just dive a little bit deeper into the simple phrase, drafting with your deck in mind. It's probably something that you've internalized at some point or another, and it's a pretty easy concept to understand, right? The core principle is that your evaluation of cards and what cards you pick should be shifting pretty constantly depending on what your deck has right now and what your deck needs. I mean, the easiest example is just if you're not in the color of a card, you shouldn't take that card. But it goes much deeper than that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Unfortunately, it's not so simple as to just say, oh, you should draft with your deck in mind. Yes, obviously, but especially in Kaldheim, but in Limited in general, but especially in Kaldheim, there's so many different cards and archetypes that shift, that their power level shifts, and how highly you should be picking those cards shifts depending on what's in your deck as of right now. And like I said, this has always been a high-end limited concept, but what actually prompted me to talk about this in respect to Kaldheim was the observation that a lot of my decks that could be classified under the same archetype looked very, very different from each other. And I found that strange. And once I noticed that, I tried to analyze during my draft why that was happening. Why do all these decks that classify under the same archetype of generic aggro deck, or 5-color control, or blue-green mid-range splash, why do they all end up looking so different? And what I ended up finding as I was making picks was that a lot of the synergies and the cards in the set are very reliant on the cards that are already in your deck and what your deck is missing. And I think a big concept that is prevalent in Kaldheim is something that I like to call micro-synergies. Micro-synergies are small interactions between cards or groups of cards that improve how each other card performs. And we'll go into more specifics later, but a primary example in this set is something like Snow. And you can think of it this way, like on their own, a Snow basic or a Snow land, tap land, this is a basic, but it's Snow. It's just like if you don't have ways to use the Snow mana, it's just a basic, right? You wasted to pick on a basic. And if you don't have, and this is just a tap land with no text. And similarly, the Snow cards, the Snow spells, are just bad rate creatures if you ignore the Snow type or whatever. There's a 2-mana 2/2, there's a 3-mana 2/3, and there's a 5-mana 4/4. But, well, I guess a taps creature, but you know what I mean. And then when you combine the two, they improve each other in something that could be compared to a micro synergy. I think this is a much broader example and not exactly what I'm talking about, but it's a good starter to explain what a micro synergy is and why Kaldheim relies so much on being able to shift your evaluations while you're drafting. And then I also want to clarify the difference between a micro and a macro synergy. And what I like to classify, a difference that I like to make, like what would be a macro synergy, as to create some comparisons. A macro synergy would be a card like Run Amok or a combat trick or cheap removal being good in aggro deck. There's no specific combos, but if your game plan is to attack with cheap creatures, then cheap combat tricks that get in chip damage like Run Amoks or cheap removal that give you tempo are very, very good. So a macro synergy is a card that works well with your archetype, and a micro synergy is a card or group of cards that works well with other specific cards in your deck. Right? Okay, so that's the core concept. I also want to disclaimer, if you've made it this far, you should subscribe, because I'm going to be making a lot more guides regarding Kaldheim. This is just the first of many. Normally I do like a 1 to 2 hour guide where I just pile everything together, but I'm trying to shorten it down as to make it more compact and more focused, so you should subscribe. Yeah. Okay? Alright, so now that we've established what microsynergies are, and why they make it so important to draft with your deck in mind in Kaldheim, I want to talk about how to actually implement this information. I did a similar thing in my sealed guide, where I gave you guys some information. In the sealed guide, it was the case the format's slow, and then I told you what to do with it. Now that I've hopefully established and proven to you why I think microsynergies exist and affect Kaldheim, how should you really implement this information? Luckily, or unluckily, depending on how you want to phrase it, it's a pretty easy concept to implement. All you need to do the main barriers to implementing this, and I think the things that people struggle with are being aware that it exists, being aware that you need to be shifting your valuations. All right, that's easy step one. You need to know which cards and archetypes have micro synergies, and you should be shifting more often than other cards. And then you need to actually put the work into thinking about every pick in the context of your deck. And yeah, I mean, in the end, it's that easy. Obviously, nothing is that easy, unfortunately. I wish that could be it, because you need to have experience. You need to know it. Like I said, you need to know which cards change. You need to put the work into thinking about when different cards are good. And you also need to have enough experience with the format and with Magic Limited in general to understand why and when a card would shift its power level, right? And obviously, I want to provide you guys with more information than just go do this, figure it out yourself. So with the rest of this video, I want to spend a lot of time, as you can see by all these tabs, going over a lot of the cards and general archetypes or groups of cards that have micro synergies and that you might want to, that might either shift their power level depending on what's in your deck right now, or once you've drafted them, shift what you want to draft later, right? Okay. So before we get into that, I want to just a quick related note. I think that the concept that I'm explaining to you is a big reason why a lot of the limited content that is out there is not useful limited content and will not help you get better at limited, at least long term. I think most advice that's not backed by logic or data, or most advice that it just gives you a specific ranking for a card without logic or data behind that ranking or that color evaluation or that archetype evaluation or whatever, is not going to be useful to you. And that's a big reason why I've had a long journey with Magic. I've basically always been a limited player, and over the 5 years of playing, I've basically never stopped improving. But almost none of that improvement came from articles or advice. And I never really understood why until I started thinking about this concept of micro synergies and drafting with your deck in mind. And I think it's an important concept that you can't, like, just in Magic and limited, you can basically never say this is how good this card is. And if you do, oftentimes you end up hurting people as much as you help them, because they have a deck where a card like a Bergstrider wouldn't be good because they either don't have Snowlands, or, I mean, that's obvious, so they probably will realize it's not good if they don't have Snowlands. But like, if they just have not a lot of creatures to make advantage of the fact that it taps and prevents from untapping, so they're just playing a 4-mana 4/4, 5-mana 4/4 that gains a little bit of life, then they're not making great use of it. And if they're taking it very highly over a card that might be better in their control deck, like, I don't know, Behold the Multiverse, well, then you're not gaining much help from the strict evaluation that Bergstar is a great great common, which it is, but it's contextual. It's a very contextual card. Okay, so I just wanted to put that out there as to, I guess there wasn't really much point to doing that. I'm just like trashing other people's limited content. I also want to state that not all advice or videos are bad. Clearly, I make videos, so I think it has some use. And I actually have, now that I've gone out of my way to do so, I'm not going to list it, but I found other good sources of content who do go deeper into the logic or the data behind their claims. And I think that's super useful, but I don't like just generic color evaluations. Okay, finally, we are done with all of the generics. Now we get to get into specifics. What you should be doing with each card and each set of cards. All right, so, wait. What did I... Okay, so Snow. We just talked about Snow. I want to go a little bit deeper before we move on, but cards in specific that I think vary a lot are cards like Ice-Hide Troll and Bergstrider. So Bergstrider, like I just talked about, needs pressure. It's not a good card if you're trying to play a very controlling deck. It might be if your endgame is just to beat them up with fat creatures. Like, that can be a control deck if you're just playing fat creatures, and then it's good. But if you're playing a control deck with lots of card draw, Strider actually gets a lot worse, because it's much easier to have a scenario where all it does is gain you a couple points of life and then generate a 4/4, which they can easily interact with and then beat you down with all their creatures. And it just plays out more awkwardly if you're not trying to kill your opponent with damage at some point or another. It's still a great card, and you should still be picking it highly, but I think it's a card that shifts a lot, both because the amount of Snowlands you need to make it good and the right deck you need to make it good. And another one of those cards is Ice-Hide Troll. Ice-Hide Troll is great, but if your deck's already good at using your mana in the late game and never wasting mana, you don't actually need this card as much as normal. It's still an amazing card and a very, very premium common if you have the Snowlands to use it, always and forever. But it gets extremely broken, and it gets less broken as the amount of ways you have to use mana in the late game shifts. Because the big upside of this card is that it just instantly wins late games. If you get to a board stall of any sense, it just starts murdering your opponent, and they can't kill it ever, and they can't jump, and they can't block it, and they can't block it profitably forever unless they have some giant toughness creature. But if you're already winning late games, it's kind of hard to make this good. It's still a 3 mana 2/3 in the worst case, which is great, but you don't need it to win late games, and it's hard to leave 2 mana up on blocker's duty because you want to be spending your mana every turn in order to win said late game, right? So those are some good examples of specifics of snow cards and how they shift. And there's also the concept I talked about earlier of just snow lands and snow cards having micro synergies. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about was equipments, runes, and the necessity of having a high creature count in this format. And we're going to go into more specifics on needing lots of creatures in the format a little bit later. But for now, I just want to give a generic, like, these are good. These are micro synergy cards. All of the runes are great if you put them on equipments. Like, great. Like, they just become great cards on any of these equipments. Any of these 5, although Valkyrie Sword is not a good card, but, you know. Still, any of these 5, or these 2 commons that are already just pretty solid equipments in the set. And it's kind of hard to explain why. I'm not going to go into specifics, but this is a micro synergy. And as you pick up these, how highly you take the other one should be shifting, right? Again, easy concept to understand, harder to implement. It is important, though, to make sure you're having enough creatures, because as you don't have enough creatures, equipment get a lot worse, auras get a lot worse, and if you spend all of your mana to put a rune on an equipment just to equip to 1 or 2 creatures over the course of the game, then it's not worth it. The upside is that a single rune on an equipment can win a late game if you have enough creatures to put it on. Like, it can grind people out, even control decks, because it's very, very strong. Okay, next I want to talk about boast synergies. There's a good amount of synergies with Boast. Where did I? Oh, sorry, I'm trying to look at my guide. Boast in a good curve. Yeah. So Boast is an interesting mechanic in that the creatures with Boast, such as these 3, get a lot better or worse depending on your curve and depending on the amount of ways you have to actually make use of the Boasts. So what it boils down to is that if you have other things to be doing with your mana, Boast is a lot less good. The upside of Boast is that it lets you use your mana without needing to play a card, right? But it only really does that in a tempo inefficient way, because obviously you don't really want to pay 3 mana for a 2/1. That's not a good Magic card. But if you're ahead on board, or you're trying to go wide, and you've gotten ahead early with 1-drops and cheap removal and cheap combat tricks, then suddenly it becomes very good because it just generates free value. Similar with Firewalker and Goldmaw Champion, right? So the power level of these cards shifts a lot as you get more cards like Run Amok. It's a cheap combat trick that lets you attack, Run Amok something, and then use the Boast, and then you just get free value. Frostbite, again, cheap removal. Mammoth Growth, which you can foretell, and then on a single turn you can attack, cast this to keep your guy alive and eat their creature, and activate your Boast. And Wings of the Cosmos. I actually do think Wings of the Cosmos is a decent card in the format because of this reason. I also think that I actually forgot to pull up pictures, but I'm going to talk about it real quick. I actually missed it because I wrote an outline for this and just forgot to pull pictures up. But this is a kind of an obvious one, but lands and 5-color fixtures plus bombs and multicolored cards and sack lands. These are micro synergies. So if you take bombs early and you can tell that the deck you want to be going into is some sort of 5-color deck that allows you to play all of their bombs because you got an early bomb, then suddenly all the snow lands, all the 5-color fixtures get a lot better than if you were just playing some generic blue-green deck and the fixing didn't really give you anything and the ramp didn't give you that much because you're just using the ramp to play commons, right? And then another, I guess this one isn't actually a micro synergy, but it's a group of cards that their evaluations shift depending on what your deck looks like, and that is Foretell cards. And I talked about this in a previous video, but what makes Foretell great is that you can spend mana on turn 2 without losing a card to gain tempo later on. So the main upside of Foretell cards is that you just don't waste mana on turn 2. But the more 2-drops you have, including other Foretell cards, the less good each Foretell card becomes. So as you draft more Foretell cards, or more 2-drops, other 2-drops and Foretell cards get a lot worse because you don't really want to draw. You don't want to have too many things to spend your mana on in the early game. And a card like Dwarven Reinforcements, while good because it has Foretell, it's not a card that you'd actively want to put in your deck without Foretell. And the more 2-drops that you have, the less likely you are to foretell it on turn 2, and therefore the less value it gets, right? Okay, and then lastly, there's a lot, and I mean a lot of cards that require creatures to make them good. There's the runes that we talked about earlier with the equipments. There's Run Amok and a lot of other combat tricks that we also talked about earlier. There's Struggle for Skemfar and other good fight spells in the set, actually. There's Karfo Candlemaster. There's and many, many more. These are just prime examples of very good cards, but they require you to be having creatures in play. And then the other thing is that this set's actually a little bit choked on creatures, or on good creatures at least. There's not that many creatures that you actively want to put in your deck. So you do need to make sure when you're drafting your deck that you're going to have enough creatures if your game plan or if your specific cards want you to have creatures to make them good. And I think that's something that I struggled with actually, and still possibly do, because I'm not a very aggressive player, and I'm also not very good at looking out for my curve and for my creature count. Because in a lot of decks, you can't ignore creatures, and in a lot of formats, you can't ignore creature count if you're playing any sort of mid-range or control deck, but in this set, that's not true. A lot of the aggressive decks need... a lot of the mid-range or controlling decks still need a lot of creatures. And there's also cards like Bergshrouder, like I said, that get much better if you have more creatures to make use of it. Cards like Runashore, which we'll talk about even later about Runashore. All right, so now that we talked about these general things, these general concepts, I want to move on to just a list of specific cards. I won't go that much into detail. I'll just talk about the card a little bit and why it shifts, its power level shifts as your deck progresses. All right, so Bloodseeker Berserker, pretty fairly obvious. It's only good if you can double spell. And how do you double spell? Well, you have Foretell cards to discount mana on your future creatures, and you have cheap cards. So this card gets better if you have cheap cards get better if you have this card. Pretty solid, pretty obvious. Same with Clarion Spirit, similar thing. Great card in general, but, I mean, these are great cards, always, but their evaluation should be shifting based on what your deck looks like. I saw an example on Twitter a little bit while ago about whether you should be picking Clarion Spirit or Raydan, the 2/3 flying rare with the flip side of the shield. And I think it's close, and the ultimate tiebreaker is usually what's in your deck. I think Spirit might be a little more powerful in a vacuum, and pack one, pick one. I'd probably take Spirit because you can build around it pretty well. But as your deck progresses, there's definitely a world where I don't think I'm going to be triggering this card that often, and therefore I'd much rather take Raydan. Okay, another one is Igna. Pretty self-explanatory. It's just that, like, it's only good if you don't have other ways to spend your mana on turn 4. It's good if your deck is weaker. If you have a very powerful deck, you don't need to scry as much because your card consistency is already good, similar with looting, but your card consistency is already good, so you don't need to have card selection. It's still good that it helps you not flood, but less important, it's got a bunch of synergies with board wipes and fight spells, because you can engineer her being able to draw 3 cards. And again, it's a card that's always great and you'll always play, but your evaluation of it should be shifting pretty often. Like, comparing this to Behold the Multiverse. There's scenarios, even though, like, in a vacuum, one of them's better than the other one, as it kind of has to be, they do shift pretty rapidly as to which one will be better in your deck at any point. Another one, which I forgot to pull up, is a card like Basalt Ravager. Apologies for having to pull this up. I didn't do my prep work thoroughly enough, I guess. But let's find it. Where the fuck is it? Cringe. I'm just gonna give up, maybe. When do I just give up? There it is. Basalt Ravager. No. This is cursed. Okay. Anyways, yeah, Basalt Ravager. Pretty obvious. It's a 4/2, and it pings. Always a good card. Shifts depending on your curve. You need cheap creatures so that you can actually play it on curve and have it be good. And you need wizards and giants and wizards and giants and Chandelians, and then it becomes good. Stuff like that. I mean, this isn't too in-depth. I've just been giving you guys a list of cards that you should be looking out for that their power level shifts as your deck progresses. Mistwalker. I think Mistwalker is actually an interesting one in that it shifts a lot, and people aren't aware that it shifts a lot. Because I have people saying that this is a great blue common that you should be taking actively, and I have not found that. And the reason that I think I haven't found that is that a lot of my decks are lacking creatures and threats, and this card is not a good threat. It's also not good with a lot of cards that synergize with creatures. It's not very good with equipments. It's not very good with combat tricks. It's mainly useful as a conjunction with Foretell, because going turn 2 Foretell into turn 3 this card means that you can block their cards pretty well, and then in the late game, it can be a threat. But you can't rely on this to get on chip damage, and you can't rely on it to always be a good blocker. If you're going 2-drop, like an actual 2-drop, like a 2-drop creature, into this card, it does not look very powerful, because you don't need it to block, and it doesn't attack very well, and you don't have the mana to spend to activate it. So that it just looks kind of awkward. Similarly, I think Mist of Lichara shifts a lot. I think it's a good replacement for 2-drops, and I think it's good if you don't already have 2-drops, but it doesn't scale very well in the late game, and it's not hard removal, so if you have good ways to gain tempo early, you don't need this card or want this card very often. Disdainful Stroke, I think there's a pretty obvious one as to whether it's good or not. If you have ways to spend mana at instant speed, like Behold the Multiverse or Squash, then it gets a lot better because you're less likely to waste mana. It's good if your deck gets ahead on tempo early and then is able to punish your opponent for trying to cast expensive spells by stroking them. It's good if you have lots of 2-drops, so you can double spell, playing a 2-drop plus leaving this up on turn 4 or turn 5 or whatever, and that's about it. Master Scald, another easy one. It's good with artifacts or enchantments. They go in your graveyard, i.e. mostly Sagas, but there's a couple other good ones in the set. And it shifts a lot, because I've had cards where this deck is insanely broken, and I've had lots of decks where I pick it on a hedge, and it just doesn't end up being good. And so it buffs the other Sagas that you could pick later, and it gets buffed by the Sagas you already have, and so on. Pretty easy. We already talked about Tuscary Firewalker earlier, but I wanted to reiterate, because it's actually, it has a lot of costs. It has a lot of... Your deck has many ways that it can impact how this card's good. So there's the boast impacts of wanting to have combat tricks and cheap removal that make it good. And then there's also the impact of wanting to have a lot of cheap cards, so you're less likely to whiff when you activate the boast. And the more cards you have that are awkward to cast, either because you're splashing them or because they're expensive, the worse this card gets. Jaspara Sentinel? Oh, wait. Oops, I might have this in the wrong order. Whatever, we'll just move on. Or no, we won't. Okay, so Jaspara Sentinel, I think this card's actually pretty underrated. I don't know why people don't take it highly, but I have a lot of decks that it ends up being good. The 1/2 stat line is not bad in the format, and there's a lot of decks where I both have a lot of powerful things to do in the mid to late game that might require more mana or other colors, and I just want to get to those as soon as possible. And there's also a lot of decks that I have ways to use this 1/2 in the late game, actually. Cards like Jarl of the Forsaken, or combat tricks, or equipments, like we talked about earlier. There's lots of ways to actually make this 1/2 into a real card in the late game, which is why I think it's better than it's given credit for. Moving on to the actual Jarl of the Forsaken. Yeah, I mean, this one's also an obvious one. It's good with cheap creatures, because it has flash, and it's a foretell card, and you can block with a 1-drop or 2-drop, and then kill their big creature, and then you're happy with that. It's good with cheap removal. It's good with ping effects. It's good with low toughness, low power, high toughness bolt creatures. It's good against low toughness, low power, high toughness creatures, and so on. Run Ashore, I think this card is great. First of all, if you haven't watched my videos so far, I love this card. I think it's very, very powerful, and people are overrating it by a lot. I mean, a lot. But people don't pick it very highly. And even though it is a great card, it actually shifts. It's got a similar paradigm to the Bergstrider, in that its power level shifts a lot depending on how aggressive you are and how much you can get tempo early. It actually does not work very well with foretell cards, because you want to be ahead on board to make this card as good as it can be. Because if you're playing it when you're behind, if you're trying to use it as a control card, it's not going to be great. You're going to 1-for-1, probably, because they have to put a card on top or bottom of the library, and you're going to bounce a card, so you're going to get a decent amount of tempo, but you can't really bounce cards with ETBs, which is awkward. Your opponent might not be playing cards that let you get value out of it in the late game, and then you're just kind of looking at it and being sad. And if they're very far ahead on board, you actually take damage while you're 1-for-1ing them. Like, you bounce something, you put something on top, they draw it, replay both, and you take damage from an extra creature. And that's horrible. So this card gets a lot better if you have lots of creatures to pressure them, to make advantage of all the tempo you're getting, and it gets better if you have good ways to spend your mana early. Next up, Masked Vandal. Pretty obvious, but I actually don't think this card's as good as I did originally, or as good as other people make it out to be. It's only good when you both want 2-drops and are able to make the disenchant good. So you need enough creatures that you can use it in the late game and trade off, but you also need the 1/3 to be good, because you don't want either mode on their own. You don't want to play a 2-mana 1/3 with no text, and you don't want to have to wait to the late game to play a 1/3 that disenchants. Neither of those are very good on its own. The upside of this card is its flexibility. So if you can't make this a flexible card, it gets a lot worse in your deck. Trishka's Heist, pretty obvious one. It's just good with cheap creatures that you can exchange. It's good with auras, because if you exchange an aura, it will still be attached to the same creature, and you'll just get to steal enchantment for free. And it's good in somewhat aggressive decks, because the Drain 3 is more relevant. Fall the Imposter, card's great, but I've actually played with a lot, and it hasn't been as good as I thought it was going to be in a lot of my decks. And the reason for that is that you need to be playing it on curve. So it's not good to splash, and it's not good unless you have 2-drops or other cheap creatures to put it on. Because if you play it on turn 4 or 5, it's still an okay card, but it's so slow that by the point you actually exile the creature, which is the only real mode on this card, you might have just lost. So you need this card to get down pretty early to make it good. And if you don't have a 2 or 3-drop, then you're not getting the counter value. So if you're not getting the counter value, then again, it's not a very good card. You're paying 3 mana to wait 3 turns, then kill a creature. So you need both modes to be good, and for that you need both a curve and you need to have it be somewhat on color at least. And then finally, last card, I promise, we got Raider's Carve. It's another card I think that's similar to Run Ashore in that it's underrated, and it's a very, very good card because the upside of it is so high. You're playing a 3-mana 4/4 that draws like 0.4 of a card every time you attack with it, which is a very, very good card. 3 mana 4/4 already just wins games in aggressive decks that can crew it. And in addition to that, it also might draw cards and quote-unquote ramp you, I guess. But it's important, obviously, that you have creatures with 3 or more power. And while there are a lot of those, it's also important that those creatures aren't too expensive, because you don't want to have to wait until turn 5 or 6 in order to make this an actual creature. So you need a very specific subset of creatures that you're able to play on turn 3 or 4 and that have 3 or more power. But when you get a high enough density of those cards, this card gets very, very good. All right, that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed this video. Feedback always appreciated. If you've made it to the end, you clearly enjoyed it enough to subscribe, so do that. I also stream on Twitch. Check that out. Link in the description. If you are watching this video near the time that it was released, I am probably still live playing a sealed PTQ on Magic Online. So go join there. And that's it. Goodbye.